All right, there we go. We've got some participants coming in.
Lovely. Folks, we're going to get started in just a few minutes. Just waiting for some people to trickle in still. You will know, because I will be saying more words. For those who just joined, we're just waiting a couple more minutes for some more people to join, or I guess 1 more minute, but yeah. Cool. All right. Well, why don't we get started? I'm David. I use any pronouns. I am part of the support content team. I'm a content manager and a subject to one such round of layoffs. My last day is actually the 30th. If the rest of y'all want to make some intros.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jaffe. I am a labor journalist, and I wrote a book about work not loving you back, one chapter of which is very much about tech work. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit.
I'm Michelle Curtis. I am a rater. I work for Rater Labs. So I'm kind of at one of the bottom of the barrel when it comes to Alphabet Workers, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about that and why working and unionizing is so important for all of the work that we're trying to do.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Stephen McMurtry, he, him. I am a software developer at Google and also the communications chair of the Alphabet Workers Union, Communications Workers of America. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to have you all here. Just to give you a quick sort of summary of everything we're going to touch on before we jump into specifics. Sarah's going to sort of kick us off with sort of what's going on and, why that statement, your boss doesn't care about you. What does that mean? Let's unpack that. Let's get into that in more detail. And then Stephen's gonna talk with us some about like why that's happening. and then we'll pass it to Michelle to talk about why we need to take action. And then I'll talk to y'all some about like practical steps. What does that action look like, right? I, just for your context, have been involved in a couple labor organizing efforts in my workplace. So very much like feel equipped to talk on that front. And then please do stay at the end because we're going to do a Q&A. It's going to be great. But yeah, I think with that, unless there's anything that I forgot, I will pass it to Sarah. Lovely.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. Again, like I said, I'm a labor journalist, which means that I have spent most of the last 14 years or so learning about everybody's bad bosses. So I'm happy to be here. I wish we were in better circumstances, those circumstances being, the worker revolution had taken over all the tech companies, but we'll get there. But yeah, I mean, I'm coming obviously from the outside, although I am in journalism, which means that we are often subject to layoffs in the same waves that tech workers are, and that these companies that are that a lot of you work at have a big effect on the work that I do. So, I am not working in tech, but I am imbricated in the broader thing that we're talking about. So, but when we talk about these sort of headline level tech layoffs, we're talking about like these people that we kind of know are like the worst bosses in the world, like Jeff Bezos. Elon Musk, I think, is just like, he's taken over from Donald Trump as like the world's worst boss. But a lot of the stories we've heard about them being lousy bosses come from like the Amazon warehouse or the Tesla factory rather than necessarily the programmers who are working there. The story that the headlines at least like to tell is that working in a tech company is pretty cool. Excuse me, guys, I'm getting over a cold. So it's not that surprising, at least to me and probably to a lot of you, that tech companies which have pretended to value their employees and touted sort of informal workplaces with flexible scheduling, ping pong tables, food, toys, whatever it is, actually also considers programmers just as expendable as any other part of the supply chain. So I wanted to talk briefly about the argument that I laid out in my book, Work Won't Love You Back, and then get to the tech-specific questions before I kick it over to the folks who are going to talk to you about organizing. So the labor of love discourse is a form of sort of common sense of the neoliberal era. It serves to motivate us to work harder, to commit ourselves more fully to work at a time when working conditions are getting worse for so many people, inequality is growing, and everything else is getting less affordable. So this narrative runs through all different types of work, teaching and nursing, but also in coding and scientific laboratory work. And so while a lot of different kinds of workers that we might be talking about here don't appear at first to have that much in common, God, I'm sorry. The labor of love myth is one that unites seemingly disparate sectors of the economy. So both home healthcare workers and video game programmers have told me that, the boss says, oh, we're a family here. This workplace is a family. So I don't know if anybody wants to put in the chat if they too have been told that their workplace is a family, and if that came before or after the layoff notifications. So the situation where the labor of love, the workplace is a family, all of this garbage arose is also obviously shaped by the world outside the workplace, where housing is harder to come by and education and healthcare cost more money, where policing is harsher, care responsibilities are privatized, and immigration agents either deport people, or if you are here on an H-1B visa, you might find yourself tied to your company and then again, suddenly deportable if the company decides to lay you off. And then on top of that, we had COVID-19, which I don't really think I need to talk about that much because I think we're all very aware of what that's all done to us. But so the shift towards this idea that we should love our jobs came from changes in the actual economy. So deindustrialization, where the kind of job where you worked on an assembly line all day and nobody really cared if you smiled at the car as it came by, and in fact, probably expected you to kind of hate the job, but to stick around because the money was worth it. And you probably got decent health insurance and you probably had a union.
that's been increasingly shut down in this country and shipped elsewhere or automated away entirely. And some of you might work on automation, which we can talk about later if you want to. And so the process that sort of began this was we call it like the profit crisis of the early 70s, which again, I can get really nerdy about this stuff if you want me to later in the Q&A. But this began the process of deindustrialization, and then ideologically minded politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan really stepped on the accelerator and did it on purpose. So workers who had worked in industrial production, who were used to being able to go on strike to halt production in order to make their demands, are suddenly put in the position of calling for plants to be kept open, which is very hard to do by shutting them down. My friend Joshua Clover calls this the affirmation trap, where workers are stuck sort of affirming their own exploitation in order to be able to stay afloat, which is something that we all can probably relate to when we're talking about massive layoffs in these companies, right? It's very hard to think like, oh, we all go on strike and that'll stop the layoffs when the company wants to get rid of some of you. It becomes a complicated thing for organizing. It doesn't mean we can't do it though. And as these factory jobs shut down, the jobs that replace them are in retail, healthcare, and then in services and technology. And we've all sort of heard the story that like, oh, all those coal miners, they should just go learn to code, right? Like learn to code is kind of the thing that everybody tells them. And of course, what the boss means by these people should learn to code is we want more people to know how to code so we can drive down the cost of programmers who are good at their jobs. So we can make this another blue collar job and pay people less and make them easier to hire and fire. So this story of loving your job, this expectation that you'll love your job and be really loyal to your job and care a lot about what you do, comes at the same time as working conditions are actually getting worse for most people. And it also comes with employers sort of trying to extract more essentially humanity from workers, right? They're trying to get your creativity, your people skills, your caring, not just sort of your presence on the assembly line. And exercising all of these sort of human traits is what's supposed to make work less miserable, but it actually just helps work take over more and more and more and more of our lives. So I tell the story in the book through basically two halves. The first half of the book is about care work, which is expected to be women's work, unpaid work in the home, paid domestic work, retail work, teaching, nursing, healthcare, nonprofits. And then the second half of the book, which is where tech comes in, is the creative sector, and it's work that's seen as sort of not really work, but play. It is expected to be gendered masculine. This is the arts, media and journalism, the academy, and also computer program, video games, all those things. So one of the things that we end up with from this arts discourse that wound its way into tech is the sort of myth of the tech genius, right? And the tech genius founder, right? So the story of creative work revolves around the idea of the genius, the sort of magically talented individual who is usually supposed to be a man, who makes art or music or technology because he's just so gifted and brilliant that he can't help it. The founder who created the company in his garage and whatever, and his, the house that he bought with his daddy's money in order to have a garage, in order to create the company in his garage so we could have a cool myth. But anyway, money is not important. These geniuses just create wonderful things because they care, right? Right. This has a long history in the arts, but it's also the story of Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Elon Musk, who as far as I can tell, has only the vaguest idea of how any of the tech that he's supposedly responsible for even works. Interestingly, this is a thing that I'm kind of obsessed with. One of the roots of the word genius is male spirit of a family. So again, kind of interesting to think about the workplace as a family. Thanks, Dad. Except your dad usually doesn't lay you off. Maybe, my family's complicated, so, but right. So of course, the real history of programming actually included a lot of women. And in fact, women were the first computer programmers back on, the good old ENIAC, right up until it became clear that the job was going to both be big money and also be sort of prestigious. And then the women are pushed out. But anyway, part of the problem with this whole story, right, is that if what the genius does isn't really work, it's hard to value it properly. So the actual people who do the real work, i.e. all of you, get devalued, underpaid, even if you're comparatively well paid next to somebody who works in a restaurant or teaches public school. And then, of course, you are easy to lay off when the company needs to juice the stock price. So when I was researching the book, like reading the history of tech, you just come across like so much ridiculous hyperbole. The book that I read on the founding of the internet was titled "Where Wizards Stay Up Late at Night," which, like, great, you managed to both call them wizards and also glorify like never going home. But right, sound familiar? This is also the story of so many of these companies. Oh, well, you'll work till midnight because like it really matters, right? And these cults of the rich founder, like we can just look at Elon Musk's reply guys on Twitter, are used to convince people that you should be lucky to work at a place where some of this guy's brilliance might rub off on them, right? Like, whatever. You wouldn't want an antagonistic relationship with that guy, so you wouldn't want a union. Oh no. And this connects to the other concept I wanted to talk about, which is something that researchers have titled playbur, combination obviously of play and labor, work that isn't really work that's fun. This is obviously incredibly important in the history of tech. How many features of some of these websites that we all use were actually created by programmers who were fiddling around after hours, had an idea, and then suddenly found themselves on deadline because the boss has now announced your cool new idea at the latest shareholder meeting or whatever, and now you've got to deliver. Relatedly, quality assurance testers for games are playing games for a living, right? Except that is actually exhausting. And I don't know if we have any QA workers in the house, and they have become some of the first to unionize in the industry, including winning another victory at Activision Blizzard this last week. So congratulations if anybody here is involved in that. I would be exhausted playing video games all day, and I already have bad hands from just typing, let alone anyway. So the last point I wanted to make before I hand it over to the folks who are going to tell you more about how you can organize is this assumption that unions are for other people, right? That if your job is fun and you're relatively highly paid and maybe you're a special genius or you just work for one, and the company gives you free pizza or maybe a home-cooked meal and you get paid all right and you don't have to wear a suit and you're making stuff that's really cool, what do you have in common with coal miners? It's always coal miners. They always talk about coal miners. Unions are for coal miners, not computer programmers, as if the companies thought that the unions were for coal miners when the coal miners started unionizing, right? Like a lot of coal miners got shot trying to unionize. And if anybody wants me to talk more about the mine wars later, I'm also happy to do that. But the reality, right, is that all of these companies need your labor in order to make profits, and that all of these companies are deeply sort of woven into the machineries of state, policing, military surveillance, as well as healthcare systems and delivery of services that a lot of us rely on regularly for all sorts of reasons, especially during the pandemic, but continually. Tech, as Emma Kinema from Code is fond of saying, is in every part of the economy, and the workers who make it go are incredibly strategically important when it comes to, well, everything, but particularly when we think about who's setting the working conditions for everyone else. Tech worker power can be extremely useful for all of the rest of us. If Facebook workers had more power, maybe my stories wouldn't keep getting buried on Facebook. Just saying. And all of this can help you shape the direction of these companies so that you don't just get 1,000, 10,000 workers laid off on, a Tuesday because Elon's bored. So I will, with that, hand the mic over to the other folks who can tell you more about how to do that organizing.
Yeah, I think we're Stephen, you're gonna talk a little bit, right? Yeah, great.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to talk about, why is this wave of layoffs of tech workers happening? And just for some numbers, you can find stats on this at a website called layoffs.fyi. So recently, I think in the past year, 143,000 tech workers at over 900 companies have been laid off. And it's important that we understand why this is happening. There's a few reasons. I would say most important among them is that the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is raising interest rates in an attempt to tackle inflation. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, has been very specific about this. He gives press conferences, they have meetings every few months where he will say, inflation is too high, we need to raise interest rates. And he has specifically called out that the current labor market is what he calls, quote unquote, out of balance, which means that it's, by his definition, it means it's too favorable to workers. So today I watched a Wall Street Journal video on their homepage about tech layoffs. And it brought up that in the economy right now, there are 1.7 jobs for every one worker. And that's great for workers because it means that workers can easily leave jobs that they don't like, that don't pay enough, to go find new jobs very quickly. And that has the effect of driving up salaries, which gives people more purchasing power, which Jerome Powell posits is bad because then people are all competing to buy goods, making them more expensive, and thus causing inflation. So the goal of raising interest rates is basically that the Federal Reserve hopes to cause a recession. They'll throw around terms about, oh, we want a soft landing where we somehow raise rates enough that we don't cause a recession. But there's no indication that they'll be able to do that. And the goal is to basically slow down the economy by making borrowing money so expensive, to throw people out of work. And so then when people no longer have money to buy goods, they will stop buying goods. And then companies, because there's less demand, will presumably, I don't know if they'll lower their prices, but they will stop raising prices as fast as they have been. And the goal, or their thinking, is that will stop inflation. And so basically, there's been a lot of interlocking crises from COVID-19 to supply chain issues, and all of these things, they're asking workers like us to bear the brunt of these. And so, and they do have a point that the labor market is very strong. Over the last 3 years, there's been a big upsurge in the labor movement. You can think of Starbucks, which now has over 300 stores, I believe, who have either announced or won union drives. Amazon, we had the warehouse in Long Island, and also lots of other ongoing campaigns. Lots of unions in tech, like us here at Alphabet Workers Union and at other companies, in nursing and in education. And so we need to situate ourselves in that process, of like workers, banding together to fight against their bosses. Alphabet Workers Union and a lot of other tech unions, mostly like started getting off the ground during the COVID-19 crisis. And, we need to quickly learn from each other, teach our fellow workers, how to organize, and also begin to think of ourselves in the tech industry as workers, not, as Sarah was talking about, as, special geniuses or something like that. So how's this playing out in the tech industry? In the beginning of COVID, a lot of tech companies had very high valuations because people thought, oh, everyone will work from home forever, so it's good to be on the internet. That has not lasted. And it's affected over 900 tech companies who have laid off workers. And the reason that 900 companies is so important is that these aren't individual decisions being made at one or two firms. It's a really broad trend. And so as a tech worker, you might, instead of looking at that broader trend, you might look at yourself and say, well, hey, my company does business-to-business software, and that should be recession-proof, so I'm fine. Or, hey, Twitter wasn't actually really possible, wasn't really profitable, whereas my company is, so I should be fine. Or you might say, well, I'm in the department that generates a lot of revenue, so I should be fine. But these are just like particular details of your employment situation, and you can't rely on them. And like I said, there have been 900 companies who have done layoffs, and there are probably people who were in a revenue generating department whose company was profitable, and were like an essential part of the business, and they were still laid off. So I don't have like a crystal ball. I don't know if it's going to happen at my employer, Google, like it has at Meta, Amazon, and Twitter. But we don't know. And there's other ways that layoffs can happen. Google and Alphabet employ a lot of workers through vendor contracting companies. So like David, they might just decide not to renew contracts. And then that way they're able to cut headcount by a lot without actually having to have the bad press of, oh, Google has laid off 5,000 workers or something. There's also been, other changes within the workplace. They've cut down a lot on non-essential business travel. They stopped hiring for a period, and they also reduced a lot of headcount. So many teams like my own have to, as we're planning for the year 2023, there's a lot less work we can get done because we have a lot fewer people. And so in the last few weeks, I've spoken to a lot of my coworkers and, thinking about what are ways that we could save money if it were important for the company to save money. We could make our servers more efficient. We could have less redundancy, things like that. But something else that was brought up is that Google spends $300,000 a year per direct employee on stock buybacks. And I don't know about you, I do get some of my compensation in stock, but I would much rather prefer $300,000 in cash if Google were to give that to me, instead of trying to prop up the price of a stock that is actually down, I think, 34% from the beginning of the year. They could also reduce executive compensation, but there have been no moves to do that. So I'm sure there are lots of other ways that we could save money at Alphabet. But if the company doesn't have an incentive to listen to us and to act, then they're not going to do that. So, they have no opposition. If they decided, oh, we're going to lay off 10,000 people, we're going to end 10,000 TVC contracts, we're going to spend $10 billion on cash buybacks, there's no one to tell them no. And unless we come together as workers, hopefully in a union, we can't stand up to them. And so one thing I do have in my notes here, which is funny that Sarah brought it up, when Alphabet Workers Union went public, venture capitalist at the Founders Fund, Mike Solana, he described Alphabet Workers Union as appropriating the language of exploited coal miners because we supposedly enjoy the most privileged white-collar work experience in history. But does that matter? We can be fired. We will no longer have health insurance because it's tied to our job. People may be struggling to pay rent. If we don't have a voice on the job, then we can't control what's happening to us. So, a question for yourself is, if your company or my company announced layoffs tomorrow, is there anything that you could do right now? And, as unorganized workers, I think that the answer is no. So we may need to get organized. I'm now going to pass to Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's a great lead-in. I am going to talk about why we absolutely have to take action and why organizing is the only true long-term solution to the problems that we've been talking about so far tonight. And I'll also provide some examples of workers who are doing just that right now and are finding success at it. Stephen, you already kind of talked about how we're seeing this resurgence of interest in unions and how so many places in different industries are starting to organize. Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's. We're seeing that workers are recognizing that they really do need to come together across industries to better their work environments. And really the important takeaway from that is that without workers advocating for these changes that they're starting to see, these changes would not happen. Corporations are absolutely not granting these wishes out of the goodness of their corporate hearts. And in fact, if you even think about the protections that we have right now as workers, whether it's minimum wage or child labor laws, safer working environments, those were not just given to us as workers. Those were rights that were fought by workers in the past. I mean, even the right to unionize itself was a right that was initially fought for. And as tech workers as well, there are a lot of industries that have more of a long-standing relationship with unions, and we're not one of them. We're pretty new to this game. So unfortunately, that means that right now, comparatively speaking, we don't have maybe as much agency or control over our workplaces as we would like. So we have to get organized, because the more organized we are, the more capable we are of defending ourselves and our coworkers against things like layoffs, like we're seeing right now. We do have some fellow union members who work in YouTube music, and they just filed for a union recognition election a couple of weeks ago. So when they win their union, they'll be able to bring their employer to the bargaining table, and they will have a way to tangibly organize against layoffs. And that's something that most of us right now don't have, and we would probably like. And of course, outside of the layoff issue, which is really relevant right now, organizing just helps us all improve our working conditions in general. As a couple of examples for that, there is a Google office in Bothell, Washington, and those workers started working remotely during the pandemic. I think some of them were actually hired to work remotely during the pandemic. And then earlier this year, they were given a 30-day return to the office notice. And for many of them, especially those that maybe were hired during the pandemic, that got apartments during the pandemic, all of a sudden they were thinking about commuting costs. They were thinking about health risks associated with going back to the office, how their pay was going to factor into all of that. And it just was not a good situation for these workers. At the time, there were only 2 union workers at Bothell. But within weeks, they talked to their coworkers, they got the majority of the office on board to sign a petition, and a sizable number of workers committed to going on strike if the deadline wasn't extended. And as a result of that, in less than 48 hours, they got a 90-day extension on that deadline. As a rater, I personally have seen firsthand the change in working conditions when workers come together. And just as a little bit of background for those of you who don't know about raters, I know I kind of made a joke about the bottom of the barrel, and that's not really true. We're great. But what we do is we work from home for a handful of Google subcontractors. And most of our job involves testing, evaluating, and in a sense, training certain algorithms. The nature of our job means that we don't have much contact with our coworkers, if we have any at all. In the project that I work for, we do have a company sponsored chat, and I've been on this project for 8 years. So I've seen firsthand concerns being brought up year after year by individuals and just dismissed by management. And probably at the top of the list for raters is a pay issue because we've never had a raise in the length of the program. We do very valuable work for the employer, and most of us who have been there a long time actually received a pay cut when we went from independent contractors to employees. And just to give you kind of a rough idea, raters are currently hired on right now at $10 an hour. Most of us are making right around 13. There's a small handful of us that are making slightly more than that. And this is to do a job that is absolutely crucial for the client's bottom line. About a year ago, we had one rater join AWU, and then over spring and early summer, he started reaching out and creating communities on places like Discord and Reddit to find coworkers, and so that we could get together to talk about the issues that we were facing as part of our work. And as a result, now our raters group is up to 44 members. And as a result of our organizing, we've received our first ever email from the company responding to our request for a pay increase, which is huge because we've never received anything like that before. A group of us actually met with the CEO of the company to bring him some of our concerns. Again, huge and unprecedented. So we are definitely starting to see change happening that would not have occurred if we hadn't organized. And in fact, since I have everybody here, I am just going to throw a link to our raters campaign down in the comments. Many of us make as little as $10 an hour with no benefits. So our campaign is we've created this petition to demand that Google uphold its promised compensations to TBCs, to employees like us doing this important work for them. So I'll put it in the comments. We would love it if you would sign it in solidarity with us. If you're not in a place where you're comfortable signing it publicly, there is the option to sign it anonymously. So if you click on that, it will take you right there. So in summary, everything we've discussed so far tonight just shows how imperative it is to work together to organize our teams, because as individuals, we have way less power. Being in the union in terms of being a tech worker is really important too, because it means that we gain protection through labor law. We have the ability to present a worker voice in the media. We can intervene in legislative and political issues, and we simply have the ability to come together and take action with our team. So if you and your coworkers want to defend against layoffs, you have to reach out and get organized. If you want to put real pressure on your company to improve working conditions, you have to build your union. And it sounds overwhelming, but there are really easy next steps and concrete actions that you can take to get involved. So I will go ahead and turn it over to David, and he will go through some of those for you.
Yeah, totally. Hello again. So I really think that if there's nothing else you take away from this portion of it, it starts with a conversation. It literally just starts with a conversation about your working conditions with your coworkers. For myself, the first time I organized was actually before AWU was public. I don't know whether it existed at the time, but um, and it was a conversation with my peers about, hey, some of us are making like 30% different for the same role on the same team, employed by the same vendor company. That's wild. Like that shouldn't be the case, right? Like we're doing the same job, we have more or less the same experience, and it was from that conversation and the conversations that followed that conversation that we approached management. And at the time, they realized what it represented. If we if we were not pleased with the result, that it was basically the group of people responsible for offering all of the editorial for Google support content. So it would have basically represented a full stop of the creation of support content. That was great. Cut to the second time we organized when there was a much bigger team and it was basically the same conversation on a larger scale, right? There is this idea that I think it really goes to what Sarah was saying, right? Where inherently there is this trust that, well, all we need to do is like advocate for ourselves and things will work out. And if you look at how large businesses deal with labor organizing and deal with asks for increase in pay and other kinds of compensation, it is to isolate you. There's a reason they do that. And it is because it is through solidarity with your peers that you are able to effectively wield the power that you hold collectively. Me, David, never represented a bottleneck on a team. The group of me and the other lead writers at the time had the power to shut the whole team down. That's like, there is an order of magnitude that you are able to, like a difference in order of magnitude of the kind of power that you are able to hold as workers to advocate for yourselves when you do it together. And once again, that literally just starts with, hey, did you see that, they said that we don't get our health insurance paid for at all, or like that the premiums are going way up? Are you going to be able to afford that? I'm not. You've opened the door. It starts with those conversations. I'm not going to say you have to do this. I strongly recommend having one-on-ones where you ask people about their interest in the union, especially if you're already a member. Because the union has resources, right? People pay dues into it. People who make a lot more money than me certainly pay dues into it. And those dues result in resources that we all get to use. So the more people that you can get involved in the union, the more people you can get educated, and the more people you can hopefully work with to improve all of your working conditions. I almost said it's as simple as that. And obviously it's not simple, right? Obviously it's full of pitfalls and like things that make it more difficult along the way. But I guarantee you it is worth it. With that being said, I see some questions already filtering in. Do y'all want to start in on the Q&A?
Yes, I do. We just lost Sarah, but I assume she'll be back in a minute. So we will, whatever, let her do that. I'm trying to unmake you. Okay, here we go. Remove spotlight. All right. So now we're peers. Yeah,
solidarity.
Yes. Whatever. Some things I did want to pitch quickly to other non-Alphabet workers. So we at Alphabet Workers Union are unionized with Communications Workers of America, which does have trainings to teach you how to conduct agitational one-on-one conversations with your coworkers, eventually how to build up and form an organizing committee. and whatever. So there's actually some this weekend, and when you exit the webinar, it will take you to the sign up page, or well, at least like the schedule page for those. And so I would recommend, participating in one of those. It's not a commitment to organize with Communications Workers of America, but it's a great introduction to organizing in tech. And these are specifically for tech employees. But whatever, those sessions are a great introduction. And once you built your skills, found some coworkers who are interested in forming a union, then you're welcome to shop around with a lot of national unions who may meet your needs, whether that's Communications Workers of America or someone else. And I'd say one other point to emphasize is that, as people are being laid off, there is a lot of people are doing layoff support, which is sharing job postings or reviewing resumes and stuff like that. And those are all great things. But those are just reactive, right? That happens after you've been laid off. And if you want to stop the layoffs in the first place, you are going to need to organize with your coworkers and be unified, before or at the moment that those layoffs are announced. You can't, it's going to be way harder to do retroactively.
I want to add on to that some like the praxis of that idea, which is just to say, like, I wrote a letter to basically the vendor manager that's responsible for whether or not my contract gets renewed. When I first saw that the increasing vendorizing was some agenda for Q4 and like a nebulous email that I was not supposed to get, I wrote a letter and I reached out to my peers and said, I would love if you would sign this letter. And they said, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's likely, right? They're just saying they want to vendorize more. There's no specifics there. I will never know what would have happened if I had insisted. If I had continued to say, I really, I see the writing on the wall here. Please, I would love your help with this. But I do know now that, there's no going back, right? My contract ends on the 30th, no matter what. Talk with your coworkers now while they are still your coworkers.
All right. So I think it's time for Q&A. David, do you want to pick questions and we can pitch them to the group and whatever to Sarah as our guest especially? And yes. I'd say we can do Mind Wars at the end, and let's start with the other ones first.
Sounds good. And Sarah, just in case you're not looking at it, there is a lot of interest for Mind Wars. I want to affirm that, which is exciting. I just want to read this one out loud. Andon had said, I think I'm pronouncing that right, hopefully. The brutal foundations of labor organizing are important, vicarious experiences for our less likely to be shot age. And I couldn't agree more. Just because the methods are less brutal does not mean the exploitation is less present. Let's see, I'm just trying to, what did you find works best for doing one-on-one unionizing conversations? Does anyone else want to jump in? Because I would be happy to talk on that, but I'm also happy to hear if other people in other workplaces have other experiences that have worked, because I've already started to talk about that some.
I can jump in here. I have loved the opportunity to really reach out to my coworkers one-on-one because I hadn't had that opportunity in the past. And I think it's just really effective to sit down and just be open. Like, what are your concerns? What are your concerns with our work environment right now? And just make it a really natural sharing conversation. It doesn't have to be specifically about a union, because just in that process of two workers coming together, you are doing protected union activities. So I wouldn't overthink it. I would just think of it as a conversation where you're going in with a coworker and you're just kind of brainstorming, what the potential problems are and maybe some solutions if you have them.
Yeah, very well said. I think one thing sort of naturally becomes the other if you think about it, right? The idea that one action is not organizing and the other is sort of a false dichotomy. Totally agree. And Emily asks, I would love to hear more about, or I'd love to hear about organizing in smaller companies. If there are umbrella unions that are broader than single company, IWW, if I apologize, I'm bad at web abbreviations. But yeah, I mean, speaking to that specifically, like, I mean, CWA is much bigger than Alphabet, right? Like CWA represents many different communication orgs and everything from video games to the New York Times tech workers, right? Like, am I right with that or am I mistaken? I thought that was CWA and now I'm second guessing it. Cool. Yeah. So like suffice it to say that like individual workplaces can work towards a contract with their specific employers on specific terms, but there are larger umbrella orgs that can offer things like support, can offer like staffers and things of that nature as well. Sorry, questions are coming in fast, which means it keeps jumping to the bottom. That's a good thing, but it means I am having to continue to scroll up to read them. What's the best way to overcome a coworker's mentality of I've always been able to negotiate my wage myself? I mean, I think that question is actually very similar to the most recent question as well of how can I make people believe in unions? I talked to 20 people yesterday because they hate to return to office, but they think all we can do is fill out surveys, complain to our managers, and they think leadership will change their mind once lots of people leave the company. These are in essence sort of the same thing, right? It's either the I am the person who can help myself or we are all helpless no matter what. And I think both are like a false understanding of the power that we wield as workers. I'm happy to defer to others to talk on this because I feel like this is similarly a thing that I've talked about a fair amount, but yeah, Stephen, please.
Yeah, speaking specifically to the wage thing, I mean, that, maybe has been the case for especially some of like the biggest tech companies, like the FANG, whatever, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, for a while, where the easiest way to get a raise was simply to just move to another company. But I think as part of what I was talking about earlier about how, these high interest rates are bursting, this like tech bubble to a certain extent. And there's going to be a lot less, venture capital money, just thrown at money losing ventures like Uber and, or DoorDash and things like that, I don't think that situation, continues right now and or will continue into the future. And so, we've already seen at Google a lot of retrenchment of benefits and other things. And now, I don't think we'll be in a world where you can just leave to Facebook to, for $50,000 more as a software engineer because Facebook is not hiring anyone. And so, you are stuck where you're at for the moment. And so it's up to you and your coworkers to, take some of those super profits that Mark Zuckerberg has and direct them to your paycheck instead of to his net worth.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point to make, and it's something I sort of said in the chat earlier, just about like there's always a more efficient way to make like to get more profits for a business or for the people at the top, but the thing that is cut away from that is your quality of life, right? It's getting a wage that is a living wage or frankly like I there's like a whole separate conversation to have about comfort, but there's two questions that I think can also similarly be answered sort of together. And one is about being a virtual customer service representative, like how do you organize there? And the other is like, how do you organize in a remote environment, given people are often concerned about like being monitored, right? That fear of being watched while you organize. And I think in both cases, the answer is specifically to like create channels of communication. And Michelle, you may be able to speak to this better because I know Raiders were not connected largely at all, at least certainly in like very small subcontractor groups. But it's to establish those like outside of work channels for communication, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, we have a Discord that's very active. We have a Facebook group that isn't quite as secure. I know that there's a Reddit group. So it's just kind of being creative in how you can reach out to your coworkers, and hopefully create an environment where people do feel safe sharing, and it's some place where people can speak freely away from company eyes.
Yeah. Well, one other thing I'd throw in here to anonymous attendee number 2, and then I think also to Erie Wen, if I'm saying that correctly. Talking about, you have MS Teams or Slack or something at your company. So, you're definitely allowed to talk to each other on those platforms. You should assume that whoever your sysadmin is can pull everything that you've sent. But, that is like one of the hard parts of it is that, we've done a better job, and it's maybe a little easier for us because we've decided to go public, within the company, so that people know they can trust us with their information. But like that is, if you are going to get to the point where you're going to form a union and like kind of stand together with your coworkers, they need to be able to trust you with their phone number. And so, and a lot of times that's like one good hump to get over. You say, hey, like we've had this conversation, we're both agitated at work. I want to talk to you about something. Don't use the U word on MS Teams or Slack. But then, hey, can I message you on Signal? Can I shoot you a text? Or can I email you at home? All of those things are ways to move the conversation off of the corporate network. But it's also a way of like building trust to actually get there. So, it is uncomfortable, and you may get some people who are like, that's weird. Why can't you say it here? And part of building the relationship is you need to say, well, I can't, but let's have that conversation and then figure out where to go from there.
Yeah, no, very well said. And just to add on to that too, like just to put up correct, there are certain kinds of conversations that are protected under the like National Labor Relations Act. I'll let Sarah jump in as well. But I just like conversations about like what everyone's making can actually be a great way to like force the conversation with management. I hate to say it on those terms, but like, I mean, as someone who personally had my boss say, hey, you need to get people to stop talking about what they're making. That was a very powerful tool to then have in conversations about wages, because he's legally not allowed to ask that. So like I suffice it to say that like those conversations are protected, but I say that with the grain of salt of like the ire that you draw from your employer. Sarah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was actually going to say that this is related to the previous questions, right? Which is like you have employees who are various levels of believe in the thing, right? Believe in the company, believe in the boss, believe in their own power, believe in basically where they fit in the genius tech person narrative. I'm so important to the company that I can negotiate my own thing by myself. And like, look, I'm a freelance journalist who writes books for a living. Like I do have to sort of negotiate based on my own swag a lot of the time, which is frankly a pain in the ass. And freelancers are banned from unionizing in various ways. So like labor law, as Michelle and David both said, can be both on your side and not, right? So like the process is a giant pain in the ass. There's a reason that the Alphabet Workers Union did not go for an NLRB election, right? But also, as Michelle said, right, just talking to your coworker about what you would like to improve at work is technically protected concerted activity. You don't have to be in a union for the law to protect you. This is one of the very few ways American labor law is better than most other countries. You are protected whether or not you are in a union. Now, the protections, because the board doesn't have a whole lot of power to do much, the last time Elon Musk got in trouble with the labor board, he was supposed to read something out loud in front of the factory in Fremont. And as far as I know, he has yet to do it because he keeps appealing it to different courts. But these things are protected. And that is something to sort of be aware of. That said, the first thing I always say to people is don't organize using your work email, don't use the work Slack, don't use any of those things for a lot of reasons, right? Don't put that much that you really value on your work email, because like if the company decides to lay you off suddenly and you lose access to that work email, you lose all those contacts. So this is just general, life advice for facing layoffs, which is, I had a work email once for a journalism job, and I lost a bunch of contacts for sources because when I quit, they just, and so I think the thing about being tech workers organizing that's really exciting, though, is you guys actually have a lot of useful skills to offer that can be useful to all sorts of people, right? You can help me because I'm a freelancer, because you all know more about which tech platforms are secure, which ones are safe, which ones are encrypted, which ones are not, whether I should break my addiction to WhatsApp, etc. And that I think is really important. But the challenge of building trust is sort of, it can't be circumvented by tech, no matter how much the cryptocurrency bros want to convince us that it can.
I mean, what you just touched upon, I think actually really segues well into what Alejandra was asking, specifically about like, how do you organize privileged professionals? And I think the answer is in what you just said about people being skilled. Really, like harp on the point that like you have these skills because they are meant to make you money. If you got a master's degree, if you have a certification, those all you you have those things because they prove what you know and what you can do for the ultimate goal of compensation, fundamentally, at least at some level. And I think if you can frame it to people in that way, you can help them to see the value in organizing to protect the value of those things. I do want us to have some time for Mind Wars.
Can I just jump in on the privileged question too? Because
please.
like the word privilege has just gotten on my nerves at this point. Like I feel like we're at a point where it means nothing and everything, and they're just, it's thrown around a lot. But the thing that I like to say to people is there are actually two kinds of things that we tend to refer to as privilege. One is something that no one should have, and one is something everyone should have. And what you guys are asking for is something everyone should have. You are asking for dignified work, decent pay, and fair conditions, right? That is something everyone should have. Being able to buy Twitter with $44 billion of somebody else's money is something no one should have, right? No one needs two houses. That's a thing that no one should have. But like asking for decent working conditions and a fair share of the profits that you produce, or all of the profits that you produce, we're going my way. Those are not privileges that we want to do away with. And those are not privileges that you should feel guilty for. And actually the way that you can have, and I was saying this before, right? The way that you can actually be the most helpful as a supposedly privileged worker is exercising the power that you have in all sorts of ways. So one of the most exciting thing about a lot of tech worker activism has been organizing around the products you produce. So Google workers organizing around Project Maven, right? People saying we don't want tech companies to make a Muslim registry for Trump. That is an incredibly powerful thing that supposedly privileged workers can do with that power. And that only comes from organizing among yourselves. So I think, there are sort of two ways to attack that. But yeah, just as like a broad point, I feel like the word privileged just is like a stick to beat other people with way too often, and it's not terribly useful.
Totally. I mean, and I will pass it over to Steven in a sec because I have a hard stop at 6. But I just want to I really do think that one way that organizing has huge value is specifically in preventing people from compromising their ethics in what they do. Right? It's if you can hold your employer accountable for their like the actions that they take, you can work to prevent them from taking actions that go against your personal ethics. And I think that that's really important, especially with topics like AI, especially with exactly what you cited with Project Maven. So I have to go now, but it was lovely chatting with you all, and the rest of the panelists will be here to continue to answer questions. Have a good night.
All right. Thank you, David. Okay, we've got two more quick questions, and then we'll let Sarah opine on Mind Wars for a few minutes, and then we'll be done. So thank you everyone for attending. So Jared asks, what are your thoughts on the recent NLRB changes to enforcement fees announced today? Jared, I am usually a labor news head, but I do not know. So I don't know. I hope they're good.
I actually don't either. And that I'm actually like looking at my email because I usually get press releases from everything on the NLRB and I get nothing. So perhaps you can tell us what it is and we can tell you if we think it's good. I mean, more enforcement of fees of any sort is probably good, but like the problem is that the board just doesn't have a lot of power to demand anything. And like I said, like Elon Musk can just sort of appeal it to whichever circuit he wants to forever and ever. So yeah, giving the board sort of much more power of actual punishment would be great. I don't know if they can do that absent an actual change to the law.
Yeah, and more funding is something that's currently they've been talking about. I guess the National Labor Relations Board. It's like I think since 2012 they have had the exact same budget, and so actually the Union of National Labor Relations Board Workers. If you check them out on Twitter, they've been whatever kind of like raising the alarm about how they need more money to continue to be able to enforce labor law. All right, let's go to Andrew, who asks, how can I organize or participate or join a union as a currently unemployed programmer? This I am less sure of. I mean, I assume you can just like gain membership in the IWW, but how that actually relates to organizing, I'm not sure. Sarah, do you know of any examples, maybe as a once unemployed freelance journalist?
Yeah, I mean, so I am technically not employed now, and I'm a member of the National Writers Union Freelance Solidarity Project, which is a way that freelance journalists sort of bring pressure to bear on. I mean, a lot of what's happened is organizing around specific workplaces to get sort of memoranda of understanding around freelance conditions. So some unions will take at-large members. I believe CWA is actually one of them. If you feel strongly about being a member of a union and want to sort of be a member and pay dues into it. And then the other thing that's always worth doing is just following a bunch of unions and showing up to organizing, showing up picket lines, showing up to whatever's going on, coming into things like this and figuring out, where you can plug yourself in. I think because something like the Alphabet Workers Union is not a certified bargaining unit, but is in fact something that people are joining as members within the union, right? We're thinking a lot about what models for unionization might look like outside of just an NLRB certified bargaining unit, although also like NLRB elections are coming back in a way that I frankly didn't think they would. So yeah, one of the things that interests me about like British unions is you can just kind of join a union over there and you don't have to certify anything in your workplace, although it helps if you can get to a point of getting recognition. So there is just a tendency for people to like join a union. But that model often ends up something I've been guilty of myself sometimes, of just being sort of paying dues because it makes you feel like you should do it and not actually getting active in the union. So rather than worrying about being a member of something so much, I would just say like figure out where you can plug into organizing. Groups like DSA do a lot of support for organizing that's happening. And you can plug into things. And then the minute that you start at a new company, you are primed to get to organizing.
Okay, cool. We've got a lot of links. People have now informed us about the NLRB changes. So I don't know. It looks good from reading the headline, but we would need to read more to find out. I have one more organizing question from Erie that I'll throw to Michelle, and then we'll talk Mind Wars for a little bit, and then we'll be done. So Erie asks, in having those initial talks with folks, is there a risk of turning people off by being too intense about organizing? Or should I just keep firmly and gently talking to people and making direct asks?
That's a good question. I think from my experience, you get a pretty good feeling pretty early into a conversation if somebody wants to go there with organizing conversation. And if not, that doesn't mean that they're not open to working with you to make changes. It just means that for whatever reason, they're not ready to commit to organizing. But there's still a lot of work you can do with somebody that's not interested in taking that next step yet. I mean, in terms of when you're saying about making direct asks, they might be more than willing to sign a petition or to talk to this person or to speak at a meeting even. They just might not be ready to organize. So I think that there's a lot of value in really continuing to reach out and work with those people, because you don't know when or if that switch may flip, and then they may be all in with you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, let's move on to Mine Wars. Sarah, if you can give us a quick rundown of whatever the Mine Wars in Appalachia. I read the book Grant Hollow one time, and that's the extent of my knowledge. So
I'm literally sitting here with my stickers that a friend of mine was just in West Virginia giving a talk, and he brought me back some stickers from the Mine Wars Museum, which is a thing that I have not made it to yet, and I need to. Because I have been to the mining museum in England, and they actually take you down an old mine shaft, which is both cool and terrifying. And former miners do the tours, and it's really fucking cool, but also really scary. Yeah, so right. So as I think I mentioned, and somebody else mentioned, like, yeah, the mine wars were back in the day when the boss really didn't think much of hiring Pinkertons to shoot people. Pinkertons are still around, by the way. They just don't shoot people quite as often. But they showed up in, among other places, Ferguson. So yeah, the history of mining, particularly in West Virginia, is full of just fucking massacres. And I think it's worth lingering on, not because I'm not going to, like, you know, rehash the plot of Matewan or the Battle of Blair Mountain or any of these other things, but like, you would essentially have workers who were going down these mines with absolutely no precaution set, right? And the company just did not care if the mine collapsed on you. And if they don't care if the mine collapses on you, I mean, the mine collapsing on you is like, you know, they lose some fixed capital when the mine collapses. They definitely don't care if you get shot. That just costs them, you know, the cost of hiring the Pinkertons. These days, the Pinkertons are just like Jones Day and all the rest of the law firms that I'm blanking on the names of right now that show up to do the union busting. But to think about the amount of violence, the Battle of Blair Mountain was the largest battle on American soil since the Civil War. You know, and it's not just mines, it's things like the Homestead Steel Strike, right? Where, yeah, workers regularly got shot for organizing. And I think this connects actually to the question about privilege, right? Because we can say like, oh yeah, you're probably not going to get shot for union organizing now. You might get shot for Black Lives Matter protest though, so that's cool. You know, the violence is not gone. It's subtler in a lot of ways, and it's been sort of shunted into different structures, but it's not gone. It's not less brutal. And again, when we think about some of the things that some of these companies are making, when we think about drone software and surveillance and facial recognition, and things that are used by police forces, these are technologies that are, you know, the modern day Pinkertons are using on people. And they might not be using that drone stateside yet, although it might turn up the next time there's a big protest and the police car gets set on fire. But there's, you know, I think we're at more than one person killed by the police a day this year. I think we're actually at like a new high the last time I looked at the counts, because of course we don't have official counts, so we have to rely on journalists and activists to do the counting. People are still being killed by the state all the time. And so, you know, I don't mean to be like lady with her ring light telling ghost stories over here, but like, you know, but like the state violence isn't gone. And it's moved and it's shifted. And yeah, we can tell ourselves nice stories about that we're privileged and therefore we're safe from it. But that's not really true. And so, you know, when you think about, again, like the Battle of Blair Mountain was kicked off by a protest march, and the cops show up and start shooting. Mate One is in fact a great movie that everybody should watch. James Earl Jones is in it. And one of the interesting things that it dramatizes is the tension between Black and white miners and the challenges of building interracial unions back in the day, which are not challenges that are over now by a long shot. Yeah, I think to bring home sort of the history of state violence on union organizing. I've written about the mine wars. I've written about the way that the teachers' strikes in West Virginia in 2018 sort of deliberately evoked the mine wars by wearing red bandanas. That's where the history of that's where they come from, the mine wars, right? And it's not an accident that the counties that kicked off first with the West Virginia teachers' strike were the counties that had seen the mine wars. And again, we're seeing and we're talking about state violence in a lot of ways now, not around union organizing as much, but around policing, around white supremacy, and around, again, these sort of technologies that build in some distance from that violence. So no longer do you have a Pinkerton who shows up at your house and tries to intimidate you out of organizing a union. Now your company just installs a keystroke logger on your computer to figure out what you're doing. And they have, I'm sure all these terms are flagged, right? Like don't say union in the Slack. There are certain words you don't want to set off the thing. And so I would just encourage people to think about how that power operates in all of our lives in slightly different ways than we maybe think about, but but yeah, there's also a PBS documentary on the mine wars that I actually haven't watched yet, but it's supposed to be good. The PBS American Experience thing, I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now because it's supposed to be really good. And yeah, I think also the miners shot back. Obviously, this is not just like them being massacred, right? That like these were struggles that had real, there's real stakes to this. But I think it can feel easy to be disconnected from this stuff. And, we can talk about, we sort of had the phenomenon in the Trump years of like people talking about fascism a whole lot, but then like the only thing that they would sort of approve of to fight it was like a nice orderly protest on a Saturday. I remember somebody saying like, we should have a general strike against Trump. So everybody who can take a day off, whose employers will let them take a day off. And I was like, that's not a strike, honey. Yeah, not to be like, oh, we're going to need to get a gun to fight Jeff Bezos, but Jeff Bezos has all the guns. But like, what is it that, that is so dangerous back then about a bunch of miners organizing and maybe organizing across race lines that was so terrifying that they'd rather shoot a bunch of people than let them have a union? And if the company was perfectly willing to let the mine collapse on the miners, they're also perfectly willing to keep burning the coal until the planet sets on fire because they assume that they'll be the 5 people who are safe. Anyway, so that's the documentary on the mine wars and Mate One film. Where can you watch it? Dun, dun, dun. Does it say anywhere? Come on, where can I watch it? All right, I don't know off the top of my head where you can watch it, although Criterion Collection has it, so maybe.
For all the film heads, and they can watch it on Criterion Channel, or maybe you need a DVD for it. I don't know. Okay, well, awesome. Sarah, thank you for that. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Key themes to review. There's huge layoffs in tech. Your boss will not save your job. And it's important that we come together as workers, and we need to prioritize our own economic interests over those of the boss and the company. And if we want to have the power to do that, we need to organize. So when you quit the webinar, you'll go to the code training calendar. There's some this weekend. Also, they should add more in January. And then also, if you found this webinar helpful, check our Twitter it's just Alphabet Workers Union. I don't know if this auto saves to YouTube, but if you check by tomorrow, this will be uploaded and you can share it with your friends. So Sarah and Michelle and David, who's no longer here, thank you very much. And everyone, have a good evening.